Welcome to Nocturnal Tales. Tonight, we're in a rain-lashed country house in Surrey, where respectability can be more ruthless than any criminal, and a reputation can be ruined long before the truth is known. A magnificent portrait of a wealthy heiress is savagely defaced with the single word, murderess. But when everything points so neatly toward one person, it's rarely because the case is simple. It's because the truth is far too dangerous to be left uncovered. As always, this is an original Nocturnal Tales story, written in the spirit and style of the great Golden Age mysteries, but entirely our own creation. And if you'd like more stories, you can find our full back catalogue on Patreon and Spotify, with extra new stories there as well. The links are in the description. Now then, listen closely, keep your conclusions in check, and do not trust the obvious too soon. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Painter in the Rain. I have often observed that society is nowhere more foolish than in its treatment of artists. So long as a man remains obscure, he may be cold, hungry, and entirely neglected without causing the least distress to anybody. But let him paint one celebrated portrait, or produce one canvas over which a critic may write 3 columns of nonsense, and immediately the world begins to speak of him as though he were a species of prophet, temperamental, tiresome, and entitled to behave like a lunatic in good boots. It was on an afternoon of steady rain in October that the matter of Lucien Vidal first entered our rooms at Whitehaven Mansions. Poirot and I had lunched well. He had arranged a dish of pears upon the dining table according to their degree of ripeness. I had settled myself with the paper and was reading an account of a minor cabinet disturbance that promised all the excitement of a damp match when our landlady announced a visitor. "She would not give her name, sir," said Miss Lemon from the doorway, in that level voice of hers which could have announced revolution with no more emphasis than the arrival of the post. "But she says the matter is urgent." Poirot glanced at the clock. "At this hour, when one should digest. It is already a mark against her, Hastings." The lady who entered was young, perhaps 26 or 27, very well dressed, and possessed of that cool, fair kind of beauty which in England is often taken for innocence by idiots and for breeding by everybody else. Her clothes were excellent, but not flamboyant, her face pale, composed, and strained only about the mouth. She held herself with admirable control. It was plain to me, however, that she had come on some business that cost her an effort. Poirot rose and bowed. "Mademoiselle?" She removed her gloves before speaking, not hurriedly, but with care. It struck me at once that she was one of those women who do nothing carelessly, not from affectation, but from discipline. "My name is Alice Morland," she said. "I hope you will forgive this intrusion, Monsieur Poirot. I did not know where else to go." Poirot indicated a chair. "One always knows where to go when one is in trouble, if one has read the newspapers. Sit down, I beg of you. This is my friend Captain Hastings." She inclined her head to me. "I have come," she said, "because I believe a crime may be about to take place." That, I confess, put me at once on alert. Poirot merely joined his fingertips. "May be about to take place? Then we are perhaps in time. Continue, mademoiselle." She looked from him to me, perhaps measuring how much she should say before a stranger. Poirot smiled gently. "You may speak before Hastings as before myself. He is discretion itself." I coughed slightly at this, for I have never thought secrecy one of my principal defects, but she seemed reassured. "You know the name Lucien Vidal?" I knew it well enough. Anyone who read the illustrated papers or attended exhibitions even occasionally could scarcely avoid it. Vidal, though not English by birth, had made London his stage these last 5 years. He painted portraits, great sweeping, brilliant things, all silk, candlelight, and insolence, Duchesses, actresses, financiers' wives, one or two politicians of advanced vanity. He had painted them all. The critics called him daring, decadent, modern, and half a dozen other words that generally mean the same thing, that the man in question is fashionable. Poirot nodded. A very celebrated painter. He is called genius by some, charlatan by others. Usually that means he is successful. Miss Morland's hands tightened very slightly in her lap. He is engaged to marry my cousin. Ah, cried Poirot. At once the affair becomes human. My cousin, Margaret Ashcombe, is rich. Very rich. She is also impressionable, obstinate, and convinced that all opposition to her wishes is tyranny. Mr. Vidal has painted her portrait. During the sittings he attached himself to her. Now the engagement is announced, though not publicly. "And you do not approve?" I asked. She turned those clear grey eyes upon me. "No, because I believe he means to ruin her." "Financially?" "In every way." Poirot leaned back. "This is serious, yet not perhaps criminal." "No," she said, "not by itself, but that is not all." For the first time her composure wavered. She drew a folded paper from her handbag and handed it to Poirot. "I found that this morning in the library at Blackthorn House." Poirot opened it carefully. I got up and stood beside him. The paper was thick, cream-coloured, and bore only a few lines in a bold, slashing hand. "If the portrait is shown, I shall speak. If I speak, one of you will hang." There was no signature. "Well," I said, "that is plain enough." Poirot said nothing. He turned the sheet over, sniffed it lightly, then held it to the light. "Continue, mademoiselle." "Blackthorn House belongs to my uncle, Sir Henry Morland. We are staying there for a week. My cousin Margaret is there. Mr. Vidal arrived 2 days ago with the finished portrait, which is to be unveiled privately on Friday evening before a number of guests. Last night after dinner, there was some sort of quarrel in the studio wing. I did not hear words, only voices. This morning I went into the library and found that note half burnt in the grate. It must have been dropped there by mistake or overlooked." "Who had access to the room?" "Everyone in the house, more or less. My uncle Margaret, Mr. Vidal, myself, our family solicitor, Mr. Penrith, and a few guests who arrived yesterday. Lady Frances Welby, Dr. Stephen Kerr, and Mr. Adrian Bell." "Bell?" I said. "The critic?" She looked surprised. "Yes. Do you know him?" "Only by reputation. A nasty pen." "A man with enemies is like a tree with leaves," murmured Poirot. "Natural and plentiful. Tell me of the others." She did so succinctly. Sir Henry Morland, her uncle, was a collector and patron of the arts, though by her tone I gathered that his taste was guided chiefly by what cost the most money. Margaret Ashcombe, his niece and heiress to a separate fortune, had lately taken it into her head to cultivate artistic society. Lady Frances Welby was an old friend of the family. Dr. Kerr was in attendance upon Sir Henry. Adrian Bell, the critic, had come down for the unveiling and a weekend party of distinguished boredom. "And Mr. Vidal?" asked Poirot. At that her voice changed almost imperceptibly. "He is charming when he chooses. That is his chief talent outside painting. He can make a woman feel that to be looked at by him is an honor, and a man feel that to be disliked by him is somehow vulgar. He speaks very little about himself. No one ever seems to know whether he is rich or ruined, sincere or theatrical. One never catches him in a simple mood." "A bad sign," said Poirot. "Simplicity is the rarest and best of things." She hesitated. "There is one more fact. Some months ago a woman in Paris, an American, shot herself. Or at least it was called suicide. She had known Vidal well. There were rumors. They came to nothing. I confess that this gave me a distinct sensation. Artists, suicides, heiresses, anonymous threats. It was the very stuff of melodrama. Poirot, however, continued to look mild. "And you connect this with your cousin?" "I connect Vidal with danger," she said. "I do not know of what kind, but I am certain of it." Poirot was silent for so long that I thought she might imagine him unwilling to act. Then he said, "Why come to me before going to the police?" A faint colour rose in her cheeks. "Because if there is no crime, only scandal, the police would do harm merely by appearing. And because if there is a crime to come, I thought perhaps you might prevent it." Poirot bowed his head. A very sensible distinction. He rose and stood with his back to the fire, looking down at the note in his hand. "This portrait, it is important." "Yes? Why?" She stared. "I do not understand." "No? Yet the note says, if the portrait is shown, not if the marriage is announced, not if Vidal remains in the house. The portrait, then, is at the center." She considered that, and I saw a shadow of alarm move across her face. I had not thought of it like that. "No, but somebody has." He crossed to the window. The rain struck the panes in silver threads, and beyond them London looked grey and temporary. At last he turned. "Mademoiselle, we shall come to Blackthorn House." Her relief was immediate, though she mastered it quickly. "Today?" "This evening, if possible. One does not refuse an invitation from danger when it presents itself so politely." "You are very good." Poirot smiled. "Not good, interested. There is a difference." She stood, thanked us, and after a few practical arrangements took her leave. When the door had closed behind her, I turned at once to Poirot. "Well," I said, "a blackmail threat, a dubious painter, a rich fiancé, and some mystery attached to a portrait. It looks ugly." Poirot shook his head. "No, Hastings, it looks arranged." "Arranged?" "Yes, like a canvas. One has placed the colours boldly, the famous artist, the threatened scandal, the heiress, the troubled cousin. It is almost too good. Therefore I ask myself, who is painting the picture for us?" "You think Miss Morland is not to be trusted?" "I think only this. When people come to us with the truth, they usually bring also a little vanity, a little confusion, and a great deal of irrelevance. She brought us a story admirably composed." "You mean she left things out?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "My friend, everybody leaves things out. The question is, which things matter?" He glanced toward the table where the pairs still stood in exact formation. "Pack your bag. We go into the country. There we shall see a great painter, a beautiful heiress, and a portrait that someone fears to unveil. It promises to be either extremely foolish or extremely dangerous." As events proved, it was both. Chapter 2. Blackthorn House. Blackthorn House stood in that part of Surrey where wealthy men contrive to persuade themselves that they are living in the country while remaining within convenient reach of London. It was a large red-brick place of the late Victorian period, with long windows, climbing ivy gone dark in the rain, and the sort of terrace from which one imagines ladies in white would once have looked across lawns at lawn tennis and disappointment. We arrived a little before 7, the evening having closed in early under a low sky the colour of pewter. Lamps already shone within the house, warm and golden against the wet dusk, and a footman admitted us with that grave expression of respectful fatigue peculiar to servants in establishments where the guests are numerous and the tempers variable. Miss Morland received us in the great hall. There was no exaggeration in saying that she seemed relieved to see us. Yet she did not flutter or rush. She was one of those women whose self-command survives even the moment when one sees that it costs them something. "My uncle is in the drawing-room," she said. "I told him only that I had asked a friend of my father's acquaintance to come down on a private matter. I thought that would be simplest." "Excellent," said Poirot. "A lie that is neat and useful becomes almost a social virtue." She allowed herself the faintest shadow of a smile. The hall itself was spacious, panelled in oak, and decorated with just that mixture of ambition and vulgarity which marks a collector who buys not from love, but from competition. There were tapestries too bright to be old, bronzes too polished to be important, and pictures hung in such profusion that no single one could reasonably be seen. In the centre stood a marble table bearing a monstrous arrangement of lilies, whose scent was so heavy that I could hardly imagine how anyone but Poirot could endure it. He sniffed delicately. One murders flowers by excess, as one murders conversation. Miss Morland led us into the drawing-room. Sir Henry Morland rose from a chair near the fire. He was a broad, fleshy man in the late 60s, with prominent white eyebrows, a red face polished by comfort, and the impatient manner of one long accustomed to having expensive wishes fulfilled without delay. He wore an evening coat too tight across the waist, and held a newspaper he had not been reading. "My dear Alice," he began, "who are these gentlemen? You said—" Poirot bowed. "Hercule Poirot at your service, Sir Henry, and Captain Hastings." At the name he started, and his heavy face altered. "Poirot? The detective fellow?" "The same, though I should prefer to be remembered for my order and method." Sir Henry turned sharply to his niece. "What the devil does this mean?" Miss Morland met him steadily. "It means, uncle, that I thought it wise to ask advice before matters go further." He swore under his breath. "My household is not a music hall. I do not invite detectives to lurk about the place because women take fancies into their heads." Poirot spread his hands. "Then consider me not a detective, but a guest of Miss Morland's concern. If there is nothing to trouble you, I shall be a charming irrelevance by tomorrow morning." Sir Henry stared at him. There was something in Poirot's composure that often disarmed bluster more effectively than opposition. The man grunted. "Well, you're here now. Sit down, then. But I'll have no scandal. I won't have the servants talking, and I won't have any theatrical nonsense before Friday." "Friday," said Poirot softly. "The unveiling of the portrait." Sir Henry shot another look at Alice. "So that is what she told you?" "She told me enough to make me interested." The old man dropped back into his chair. "Interested. Everyone is interested. That is the mischief. Vidal paints one picture and suddenly every fool in London must have an opinion about art. The thing is a masterpiece, I'm told. Bell says so. Vidal says so. Margaret says so. I paid enough for it to make it one." At that moment the door opened and a woman entered. I knew at once that this must be Margaret Ashcombe. There are women who are beautiful in the ordinary sense, and women who are striking by force of personality. She had a good deal of both. She was tall, fair like her cousin, but warmer in colouring, with clear skin, bright eyes, and an expression at once eager and wilful. She moved quickly, as though impatience propelled her. She wore a gown of deep green velvet which suited her exceedingly, and there was about her that unmistakable air of a woman accustomed from childhood to admiration and contradiction in equal parts. She halted when she saw us. "Oh," she said, "we have strangers." "My dear," said Sir Henry heavily, "Miss Morland has brought down Monsieur Poirot." Her brows lifted. "The Poirot?" Poirot bowed again. "The same inconvenient person." For a second her expression was unreadable. Then she smiled. "How delightful. We are becoming quite dramatic." Miss Morland said quietly, "Margaret, I thought it best." "Yes," said Margaret. "You often do." It was not an open quarrel, but there was enough in the tone to tell me that the cousins stood on uneasy ground. Margaret turned to Poirot with bright curiosity. "You have come because Alice imagines something dreadful is about to happen, I suppose." Poirot did not answer directly. Mademoiselle imagines that prudence is preferable to regret. How wise, and how dull. She crossed to the fire and held out her hands to it. Do you know, Monsieur Poirot, I believe England positively enjoys expecting disaster. Rain, taxes, and family objections, none of them can be borne without the conviction that they are unique tragedies. Yet tragedies do occur, said Poirot. She glanced back at him. Yes, she said, but not always where the family predicts. Before Poirot could reply, a man's voice sounded from the doorway. Margaret, you are cruel. You steal the conversation and leave nothing for the rest of us. The speaker came in with an ease so perfect that it might have seemed natural had it not been just perceptibly rehearsed. He was of middle height, very dark, very well made, and perhaps 38 or 40. His hair was brushed smoothly back. His face was lean, clean-shaven, and of that kind which appears on first impression handsome, though after a moment one sees that the real quality is not beauty but force. The eyes were remarkable, heavy-lidded, amused, watchful. One felt at once that he observed more than he chose to say. Even had I not known it, I should have guessed this was Lucien Vidal. He wore evening clothes with a slight foreign flourish, impossible to define, yet quite unmistakable. Nothing about him was untidy, but nothing was conventionally English either. He looked, in short, exactly like the sort of man society adores condemning while secretly inviting to dinner. Margaret turned to him with instant warmth. Lucien, this is Monsieur Poirot and Captain Hastings. Vidal stopped dead for the smallest fraction of a second. It was enough. Then he smiled. Indeed, Blackthorn grows more interesting every hour. His voice was low and musical, with only the faintest trace of an accent. Poirot regarded him with friendly interest. Monsieur Vidal, your reputation arrives before you. And yours before everybody, said Vidal. That must be tiresome. Sometimes. Vidal laughed softly. I should imagine one cannot breathe in England without someone suspecting a motive. In my experience, said Poirot, they are usually right. There was a moment then, no more than a glance exchanged between them, but I felt it distinctly. Each man had taken the measure of the other, and neither had found the result negligible. Vidal turned to Sir Henry. May I ask whether our distinguished guest comes as admirer of art or guardian angel? Sir Henry muttered something indistinct. It was Margaret who answered. Alice has been nervous. How loyal of Cousin Alice, said Vidal, and though the words were courteous enough, there was steel under them. Miss Morland said calmly, I prefer nerves to negligence. He looked at her. Yes, he said, that is your great charm. You always prefer the proper emotion. The door opened again, and the butler announced dinner. That meal remains in my memory, not because anything overt occurred, but because the atmosphere was already charged in a way which made the smallest exchange seem significant. When danger is really near, conversation does not grow dramatic at once. On the contrary, it becomes absurdly ordinary. People discuss the weather, fish, books, politics, and the arrangement of flowers, while underneath all of it some deeper current moves soundlessly toward violence. We were 12 at table. Besides our host, Miss Morland, Margaret, and Vidal, there were Lady Frances Welby, a handsome, faded woman with a manner of easy assurance, Adrian Bell, the critic, thin, dry, and maliciously amused by everything, Dr. Stephen Kerr, dark and reserved, a young man named Reggie Ashcombe, Margaret's brother, cheerful and somewhat blank, and several others of less consequence. Bell proved exactly the sort of fellow I dislike, one of those men who speak of other people's work as though the chief pleasure of civilization lay in finding fault elegantly. He began almost at once upon Vidal's latest exhibition. You have become less merciful, Vidal, he said. 3 years ago you painted women flatteringly. Now you paint what they fear they are." Margaret laughed. "That is why great painters are dangerous." "On the contrary," said Bell, "that is why they are useful. They tell the truth to the vain and charge them for it." Sir Henry grunted approval. Vidal merely smiled. "The critic," he said, "is always happiest when he mistakes injury for honesty." "And the painter," said Bell, "when he mistakes vanity for immortality." "Gentlemen," said Lady Frances lightly, "must art always sound like an expensive duel?" Poirot, who was opposite me, ate very little but observed everybody. Once or twice I caught his eye directed not toward the speakers, but toward Margaret. She was animated, bright, and entirely alive, yet beneath that brightness there was strain. She laughed quickly, contradicted quickly, drank more champagne than was perhaps wise, and looked often at Vidal with the fixed intensity of someone who wishes not merely to love, but to be reassured. Miss Morland spoke little. Reggie Ashcombe talked horses with excellent emptiness. Dr. Kerr, when addressed, answered sensibly and briefly. It struck me that he watched Sir Henry as much as he dined, and once I saw him refuse the old man a second glass of port with the quiet authority only a doctor can manage. After dinner, the ladies withdrew. Bell lit a cigarette and leaned back. "Well," he drawled, "Friday will be amusing." Sir Henry frowned. "What do you mean by that?" Bell blew smoke. "My dear Morland, a portrait is never merely a portrait in a house full of relatives. It is an announcement, a challenge, and sometimes a sentence." I saw Poirot's head move slightly at that. "A sentence?" he repeated. Bell shrugged. "Paint reveals. Families dislike revelation." Vidal, who had been looking into his glass, said quietly, "Only when they have something to conceal." That produced a small silence. Sir Henry broke it with annoyance. "Everyone conceals something. Good manners depend on it." "Then let us be grateful for good manners," said Poirot. Presently we joined the ladies in the drawing-room. Music was proposed and abandoned. Bridge was suggested and refused. People drifted in those shifting little groups, common to country house evenings. I was speaking with Lady Frances, who had a dry wit and eyes that had plainly seen more than she intended to mention, when I noticed Poirot standing near the door of the long gallery speaking to no one. That, with Poirot, is always a sign that he is thinking furiously. I crossed to him. "Quite the party, isn't it?" I murmured. He did not turn his head. "My friend, this house contains too many actors and not enough audience. Everybody performs. Nobody watches honestly." Poirot's eyes travelled across the room. Margaret stood by the piano, Vidal beside her. Miss Morland was near the hearth with Dr. Kerr. Bell lounged under a portrait of some forgotten ancestor, amused by private thoughts. Poirot said very softly, "The painter is dangerous. The cousin is afraid. The heiress is in love. The critic knows something. The doctor sees too much. And our host believes money can buy silence. Already the pattern forms." At that moment a cry rang out from the gallery beyond. Not loud, not prolonged, but sharp enough to freeze every voice in the room. Margaret had straightened at once. That came from the studio corridor. Vidal was already moving. In another second, we were all hurrying toward the sound. The gallery lamps threw long reflections over polished floors and dark family portraits. At the far end, by the door leading to the studio wing, a servant stood pale and trembling. "The portrait, sir," he stammered. "Mr. Vidal's portrait. The covering's been torn down and—" He stopped. Sir Henry pushed past him. "And what?" The servant swallowed. "And someone has written across the face, sir, in red paint." No one spoke. Then Poirot said very quietly, "Now at last the picture begins." Chapter 3. the defaced portrait. There are few things more unnerving than the sight of cultivated people confronted by vulgarity. A murder, oddly enough, many will bear with a certain stiffness and even efficiency, but let somebody slash a canvas, overturn a vase, or write something indecent where it ought not to be written, and the respectable classes become at once helpless with outrage. It is as though they can forgive wickedness more readily than bad form. We crowded into the studio corridor in a body, and from there into the studio itself. It was a large north-lit room built onto the older part of the house by Sir Henry some years before, when collecting pictures had overtaken the more ordinary vices of successful men. Even by lamplight one saw that Vidal had worked there during his stay. Easels stood against the walls. Draperies hung over frames, a smell of oils, varnish and turpentine mixed unpleasantly with the damp autumn air that had crept in under a badly fastened casement. At the centre of the room, upon a great standing frame, was the portrait. Or rather, there was the portrait as it had been, and across it now the scarlet insult that had transformed it. The covering cloth lay half on the floor. Over the painted figure of Margaret Ashcombe, magnificent even in desecration, seated in ivory satin against a dark background, her face turned 3/4, her eyes brilliant and alive. Someone had scrawled in rough capital letters a single word: murderess. The paint was still wet. Margaret gave a little gasp and caught at the back of a chair. Vidal moved to her instantly, but she put him aside and stared at the canvas, as if she could not persuade herself it was real. Sir Henry burst out with an oath so violent that Lady Frances actually drew back. "This is infamous, damned infamous. Who did it?" No one answered. Bell, who had come in behind us, made a low sound in his throat. Not amusement this time, but something closer to astonishment. Dr. Kerr had gone pale. Reggie Ashcombe, to my surprise, looked not shocked so much as frightened. Poirot, meanwhile, had not advanced to the painting at once. He stood just inside the door, his eyes travelling, not to the insult itself, but around the room. "Do not touch anything," he said. It was not loudly spoken, yet there was in his tone something so decisive that even Sir Henry checked himself. Vidal turned from Margaret. "This is your household, Sir Henry. Your servants, your guests." Sir Henry rounded on him. "My household? You bring your melodramas with you, monsieur. Don't talk to me of—" Poirot raised a hand. "One thing at a time. Who discovered this?" The servant, a young footman named Ellis, stepped uncertainly forward. "I did, sir. I came to see if the lamps were trimmed for tomorrow evening, and the door was ajar. I saw the cloth down and the writing, and I called out." "You touched nothing?" "No, sir." "When was that?" "Not 2 minutes before I came for the master, sir." Poirot nodded. "And before then, was this room locked?" Vidal answered. "I locked it myself after tea. The portrait was covered. No one was meant to see it before Friday." Poirot turned. "You have the key?" Vidal produced one at once from his waistcoat pocket. Poirot took it, examined it, and then looked toward the door. It showed no signs of forced entry. He bent slightly, studied the lock, then the threshold, then the floorboards beyond. Margaret spoke suddenly. "This is because of that note." Every head turned toward her. The note Alice found. The threat. Sir Henry swore again. "So you told them all that piece of rubbish?" Miss Morland said quietly. "I told Monsieur Poirot. No one else." Bell's eyebrows rose. "A note? How delightful. We advance from vandalism to intrigue." "Shut up, Bell," said Reggie with unexpected sharpness. Lady Frances moved toward Margaret. "My dear child, sit down." But Margaret did not sit. She remained fixed before the portrait, her face drained of colour now, staring at the word across her painted likeness as though it had accused not merely her image, but her soul. Poirot spoke to her gently. "Mademoiselle, had you seen the portrait finished before tonight?" She shook her head. "No. Lucien would not allow it." Vidal said, with a touch of impatience, "I wanted the effect of surprise." "Yes," murmured Belle. "How nearly you achieved it." Poirot walked at last to the canvas. He did not examine the painted face first, as I might have done, but the red word. He studied the strokes, the drips, the thickness of the paint. Then he glanced to a side table where tubes, brushes, palette knives, and other implements lay. "This red, does it come from your materials, Monsieur Vidal?" "Obviously." "Obviously?" said Poirot. "Nothing is obvious. Is it vermilion?" Vidal stepped forward despite himself. "Yes. Mixed, perhaps, with carmine. I cannot tell without looking closer." "Do not look closer." Poirot moved instead to the table and inspected the scattered items. One brush lay apart from the others, a flat, medium-sized one, the hairs clogged with fresh red. Beside it stood a small glass jar, cloudy with turpentine. Poirot bent over it, then straightened. "Hastings." "Yes?" "Observe the jar." I did so. Floating in the cloudy liquid was a shred of white fibre. "A rag?" I suggested. Poirot gave me the glance that means I have been useful only by accident. "Perhaps." He turned back to the room. "No one leaves the house tonight." Sir Henry bristled. "Do you mean to say I'm to be ordered about in my own house?" "I mean to say," returned Poirot, "that somebody here wished to make a declaration, and I prefer declarations not to vanish into the rain." Belle gave a soft clap. "Excellent. We are imprisoned with art." "Idiot," said Lady Frances without heat. Poirot addressed the room as a whole. "I ask only a few questions. After that you may all retire, though I advise you not to sleep too peacefully." He began, not with the obvious suspects, but with Ellis the footman. The fellow had seen nothing save the open door and the damaged portrait. He had been in the pantry until called to attend in the drawing-room. He could swear only that when he passed the gallery some 20 minutes earlier, the studio corridor had been dark and quiet. Another servant, the parlour-maid, had noticed Margaret leave the drawing-room briefly before coffee, but only for a few minutes. Margaret admitted it at once. "I went upstairs for a shawl. I was cold." "And did you come by this corridor?" asked Poirot. "No." Vidal, too, had been absent for a short time after dinner. "I went to fetch cigarettes from my room." Belle smiled thinly. "A night of errands." "And you, Mr. Bell?" asked Poirot. "I remained where I was, trying not to die of politeness." Lady Frances had played patience at a side table, and could account for Dr. Kerr's presence near her for most of the quarter-hour before the cry. Reggie had gone to the billiard-room and back. Sir Henry had not stirred from his chair, 2 people confirmed it, and besides his bulk, would have made a theatrical dash to the studio improbable. Poirot listened, nodded, and committed everything, as was his way, to some internal order invisible to the rest of us. Then he asked the question I had not expected. "This word, murderous, whom does it accuse? The portrait or the original?" There was a silence after that. Margaret said with a touch of anger, "That is absurd." "Is it?" Someone wished to insult me, to frighten me. "Perhaps, or perhaps to remind you." Vidal stepped between them almost imperceptibly. "You go too far, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot's expression did not change. "Do I? In my experience, when a person protests that one goes too far, it is because one has at last reached the right distance." Margaret flushed. "I have done nothing." Belle gave a short laugh. "There speaks half the world. and almost always falsely. Reggie sprang at him. "Can't you hold your tongue for 5 minutes?" "Reggie!" snapped Sir Henry. "Stop this!" The little outbreak was enough to tell me what Poirot had likely already seen. Nerves in this household lay closer to the surface than good breeding usually permitted. Poirot now did a curious thing. He asked to see the note Miss Morland had found. She had it in her room, and when she fetched it, he laid it beside the portrait on a table. The comparison was striking at once. The capital letters on the note and those on the portrait were not identical, but there was a resemblance. The same aggressive slant, the same pressure, the same violent insistence in the downstrokes. "You think the same person wrote both?" I asked. "I think," said Poirot, "that the same person wishes us to think so, or else did not care whether we did." He asked Vidal for a list of those who had known the finished portrait was here. Vidal answered promptly. Sir Henry, Margaret, Miss Morland, Bell, and himself. He had mentioned it to no servants, and the canvas had been brought in crated and unpacked privately. "Then the knowledge is limited," said Poirot. "Yes," said Miss Morland, "but the hatred apparently is not." At that, Vidal turned to her sharply. "Why hatred? Why not truth?" No one missed the significance of the remark. Margaret looked at him in astonishment. "What do you mean by that?" But he had already checked himself. "I mean only that whoever did this believes the accusation or wishes it believed." Poirot's eyes rested on him. "Words spoken too quickly are like paintings seen too soon, Monsieur Vidal. They reveal more than intended." At last, after what further inquiries he thought proper, he allowed the company to disperse. Sir Henry insisted on locking the studio himself once Poirot had finished examining it, though the damage was done and the room could tell us little more by darkness. Vidal objected violently to anyone touching the portrait again that night. Margaret said nothing at all. She looked shaken to the core now, and even her bright defiance had gone. As for me, I accompanied Poirot to the room set aside for us in the east wing, and once the door was shut, I turned on him at once. "What do you make of it?" Poirot removed his tie with delicate annoyance. "I make of it, Hastings, that somebody here has imagination, but not discipline. You think the whole thing's staged?" "My friend, everything in this house is staged. The question is only, for whom?" He took from his pocket a very small object and held it out on the palm of his hand. It was a button, white, flat, and spattered with a trace of red paint. "Good Lord," I said. "Where did that come from?" "From beneath the frame of the portrait." "A servant's coat?" Poirot shook his head. "No, too fine. More like evening wear, or a lady's wrapper." "Then it narrows things." "It narrows nothing yet. It merely reminds us that when people commit dramatic acts, they are often betrayed by the small domestic catastrophe." He set the button on the mantelpiece and sat down. "There is more. The word on the portrait was written by someone standing very close, too close. The drips run downward in thick, short lines. The writer was not tall. Also, the cloth was not torn down in anger, as Ellis supposed. It was unpinned deliberately from one side, then allowed to fall." "What of the accusation? Do you think Margaret really is mixed up in some past death?" Poirot did not answer at once. "At dinner," he said instead, "Bell spoke of a portrait as a sentence. Vidal spoke of families concealing things. Miss Morland fears scandal. Margaret fears something deeper than scandal. And when I mentioned the possibility that the accusation might remind rather than invent, Dr. Kerr looked, not at Margaret, but at Sir Henry." "That proves what?" "That the old man is more important than he appears." He was still thinking when a knock came at our door. It was Miss Morland. She entered quickly, closed the door behind her, and said in a low voice, "Monsieur Poirot, I thought you should know. I have just remembered something. This afternoon before dinner I saw Mr. Bell and Lucien Vidal quarrelling in the garden. I heard only one sentence clearly, but it was this. If she sees it, you are finished." Poirot rose very slowly. "She sees what?" "I don't know." Poirot's face had become very grave. "No," he said, "but someone does. And I think, mademoiselle, that before this affair ends we shall have not merely a ruined portrait, but a dead body." As it happened, he was right. But even Poirot did not yet know how soon that prophecy would be fulfilled. And now, before we resume, a brief word from the Bureau. Many of you ask where our stories may be found beyond YouTube. The answer is quite simple. Only one story makes its way to YouTube each week. Beyond that, we publish 3 new stories every week on Patreon, where supporters help us keep the lamps lit, the papers in order, and the next mystery upon the writing desk. For those who are not in a position to support us there, 2 of those weekly stories are also released on Spotify. And Spotify is free. There is no need for a paid membership. Much like YouTube, listening there without paying still supports the creator through advertisements. For those who prefer to support the show more directly, we also have Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal, and you will find those links in the description below. The plain truth is that our YouTube channel is not monetized. That means these stories continue only because listeners choose to support them through Patreon, Spotify, Buy Me a Coffee, and PayPal. Without that support, productions of this kind become very difficult to continue. For those who wish to step inside the archive, Patreon offers The Listening Room, $2.99 a month, ad-free episodes and early access, The Writing Table, $12 a month, voting on themes, behind-the-scenes notes, character sheets, inspirations, alternate endings, and your name in our monthly credits. The Archive Society, $30 a month. Quarterly ebook anthologies in PDF and EPUB, with your name printed among the patrons of the Archive Society. Our thanks, as ever, to those who make these stories possible. And now, back to the case. Chapter 4. Death in the Studio Wing. More than once in the course of my association with Poirot, there are moments when he seems to hear danger before the rest of us are even aware of silence. He had scarcely spoken those ominous words when there came, from somewhere below and along the passage, the sharp metallic sound of a door violently shut. Miss Morland started. That was from the gallery stairs. Poirot was already moving. We hurried out together down the corridor and along the landing that overlooked the great hall. A current of cold air met us there. Somewhere a servant cried out. Then came the unmistakable sound of feet running, not many feet, but one person running fast over polished boards. "Quickly, Hastings!" We gained the head of the back staircase just as a figure darted across the lower passage toward the studio wing. In the half-light I could distinguish only that it was a man in evening clothes. Poirot shouted sharply, but the fellow vanished round the angle before either of us could reach the stair. By the time we had descended, Sir Henry's butler was emerging from the dining room in profound agitation, Bell from the smoking room with admirable uselessness, and Reggie Ashcombe from nowhere in particular, looking startled and guilty in the way of young men who are forever being caught where they should not be. "What is it?" cried Reggie. Poirot did not answer. He was already crossing the hall. The door to the studio corridor stood open. One lamp within had been extinguished, whether by accident or intention I could not then tell, and the passage beyond lay in broken shadow. At the far end, The studio door itself was ajar. Poirot reached it first and thrust it wide. Margaret Ashcombe lay on the floor before the portrait. For one sick instant I thought her dead, and I believe the same struck Miss Morland, for she made a choked sound behind me. But the body at our feet was not Margaret's. It was Lucien Vidal. He lay on his side with one arm twisted under him, his face turned partly upward, his dark hair fallen across the forehead. Beneath his head, on the polished wood floor, a stain spread slowly and horribly black in the lamplight. A palette knife, long, thin, and keen-edged, projected from just below his left shoulder blade. Margaret herself stood a yard away, white as chalk, one hand to her throat. There was red paint on the skirt of her gown, and one of the buttons at her sleeve was missing. For perhaps 2 seconds nobody moved. Then Poirot crossed the room in 3 rapid steps and caught Margaret by the wrist just as she swayed. "Sit down." She obeyed like a sleepwalker, sinking onto the small upholstered bench near the window. Poirot turned to Dr. Kerr, who had entered behind us. "The doctor." Kerr knelt at once by Vidal's body. He laid 2 fingers to the throat, then looked up. "He is dead." Sir Henry, who had come puffing up in our wake, stared stupidly. "Dead? Good God, dead?" Bell, to my astonishment, gave a soft exhalation almost like relief, then checked himself. Miss Morland had gone rigid. Reggie muttered, "Christ," under his breath and backed against the wall. Poirot's voice cut through the confusion. "No one leaves this room." He went straight to the door, closed it, and put the key in his pocket. Sir Henry exploded. "What the devil do you mean? My niece is in distress." "Your niece is alive, which is fortunate. Monsieur Vidal is not, which is inconvenient. Sit down, everybody." I have never seen an English country house party brought to heel so completely or so swiftly. There was something in Poirot at such moments that abolished class, ownership, irritation, and self-importance. He did not raise his voice, but he became suddenly the one fixed point in a room of disordered people. Margaret spoke first, and in such a tone that I scarcely recognized it as hers. "I did not kill him." Poirot turned. "Tell me what happened." She pressed both hands together so tightly that the knuckles showed white. "I came here because I received a note." At once Miss Morland gave a sharp look toward her. "A note?" Margaret nodded, not taking her eyes off Poirot. "It was slipped under my bedroom door after I had gone upstairs. It said only, 'Come to the studio at once if you wish to know the truth about the portrait.' There was no signature." Poirot held out his hand. "The note?" "I dropped it. Here, I think. I don't know." He found it almost at once near the leg of a table, a torn piece of thick paper folded twice. The handwriting was disguised, printed in block capitals, but it had the same ugly insistence I had seen before. "And then?" "I came down. The studio door was open. The portrait cloth had been put back partly over the frame, but not properly. Lucien was here. He seemed agitated, more than that, frightened. He said we must speak alone." She stopped, and for the first time her voice trembled. "He said someone in the house had been trying to force him to destroy the portrait." Bell gave a short, incredulous sound. Poirot held up a hand for silence. "Did he say who?" "No. He said only that the portrait showed something he himself had not understood at first, but which another person had seen immediately. He said he had made a mistake bringing it here." "A mistake of what kind?" "He would not explain. He kept saying we must leave the house tomorrow and be married at once. That, I confess, sounded to me like the sort of melodramatic urgency natural enough in Vidal. Poirot, however, merely said, 'Continue.'" Margaret shut her eyes briefly. "I was angry. I told him I would not be hustled about like a schoolgirl. I demanded to know what was on the portrait, and why that disgusting word had been written across it. He said the writing was only a warning, and that if I saw the painting uncovered in the right light, I should understand everything. Poirot's gaze flicked to the north windows and the lamps. "In the right light," he repeated softly. "Yes." He moved toward the frame and pulled the cloth aside. He had barely done so when someone came in from behind me. I heard a step, a quick one, and then Lucien made a strange sound and fell. "Did you see the person?" "No." I turned, but the lamp near the door went out at that instant. I think... She pressed her hand harder to her throat. "I think the person brushed past me." There was paint on the table and I stumbled against it. When I looked again, Lucien was on the floor. "What did you do next?" "I think I screamed. I don't quite remember. Then you all came." Poirot said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at the red smears on her gown. "Not blood? Paint." "Yes." "And the missing button from your sleeve?" She stared at him. I had not noticed. Miss Morland suddenly crossed the room. "Margaret, you must understand how dreadful this looks." Margaret gave a little laugh, wild, not mirthful. "Yes, Alice, thank you. I had grasped that much." Sir Henry rounded on Miss Morland. "Can't you hold your tongue?" "Can any of us?" said Bell. "Mr. Bell," said Poirot, "you will be silent now, or I shall arrange it more permanently." That shut him up. Poirot went down on one knee beside the body. The palette knife had entered cleanly and deeply. No struggle, at least none worth the name, had disturbed the room. Vidal had likely not even known the blow was coming. Dr. Kerr said in a low voice, "Death would have been almost immediate." "From behind," said Poirot. "Yes?" The painter's right hand was clenched. Poirot very gently opened the fingers. Inside was a scrap of cloth. Dark green velvet. Every eye in the room turned toward Margaret. Her gown was dark green velvet. She half rose. "No, that proves nothing. If someone pushed past me..." Poirot's face remained unreadable. He laid the cloth upon the table beside the note. Then his attention moved to the portrait itself. The red insult remained across Margaret's painted likeness, but now the cloth, hanging partly loose, revealed more of the upper half of the canvas. I am no great judge of painting, but even I could see that Vidal had done something remarkable. The face was Margaret's beyond doubt, yet more than Margaret's. Proud, alive, restless, and perhaps a little reckless. One understood at once why Sir Henry had boasted, why Bell had sneered, why Vidal had valued it. It was one of those portraits that seem not only to capture the sitter, but to accuse her of being herself. Poirot stood gazing at it longer than I expected. Then he stepped close. So close that his nose was almost level with the painted shoulder. "Ah," he said. It was a very quiet sound, but I knew that tone. He turned to me. "Hastings, bring the lamp nearer." I did so. He angled the light across the painted surface rather than directly at it. And then, though I am ashamed to confess it took me several seconds, I saw what had struck him. Beneath the visible composition, beneath Margaret's velvet wrap, the pale line of the throat, the sweep of satin, there was the faintest trace of an earlier image imperfectly covered over. Not enough to be seen at a glance, but enough, under slanting light, to show a dark shape at the base of the neck. A bruise. No, not a bruise exactly. The painted suggestion of fingers around a woman's throat. I stared. Good Lord. Margaret had risen despite Poirot's command and was staring too now, horror creeping into her face. "What is that?" Poirot did not answer her directly. "To repaint a portrait," he said softly, "is always dangerous. What one hides has a way of returning." Bell had come a step nearer, all mockery gone from him now. "So that is it?" Poirot wheeled. "You knew?" Bell lifted both hands. "I suspected. Not this. But something beneath." Vidal spoke carelessly after too much brandy. He said the first version had more truth than was prudent. Sir Henry said thickly, "What are you all talking about?" Poirot faced him. "I think, Sir Henry, that before he painted your niece, Monsieur Vidal painted someone else on this same canvas. Someone whose death may not have been so simple as the newspapers believed." At once Miss Morland said, "The American woman." Margaret turned sharply. "What woman?" But no one answered her. The practical difficulty of the moment now asserted itself. We had a dead man, a room full of suspects, and no possibility of keeping the thing wholly private. Sir Henry protested violently against calling in the local police at once, but even he knew the absurdity of resistance. Poirot instructed the butler to send for the police surgeon and the nearest inspector without delay. Once the message had gone, he resumed his questioning. "Mr. Bell, where were you in the minutes before the cry?" "In the smoking room." "Alone?" "Yes." "Lady Frances?" "With Dr. Kerr in the drawing-room until the disturbance." Kerr confirmed it. Reggie had been in the billiard-room again, though I doubted anyone could swear to the exact minute. Sir Henry had remained where he was. Miss Morland had gone upstairs, and then to our room before returning with us. Margaret, of course, had come directly here. "And who extinguished the corridor lamp?" asked Poirot. Nobody knew. Poirot examined the lamp itself. The flame had not blown out, it had been turned down by hand. Another small, deliberate act. At last he came back to Margaret. "Mademoiselle, did Monsieur Vidal touch you before he fell?" She frowned, trying to remember. "I don't think so. No. Except perhaps at my sleeve when I demanded he explain himself. I pulled away." "That is when he may have torn the velvet from your cuff," said Poirot. "But why keep it in his hand after death unless he seized it as he fell? You cannot think—" She stopped, swallowed. "You cannot think I stabbed him, and then remained here waiting?" Poirot regarded her. "I think nothing yet. I arrange." Her eyes flashed suddenly. "Then arrange this, Monsieur Poirot. Lucien was trying to tell me something, and someone killed him before he could say it." That, at least, rang true. The hour that followed was one of those miserable intervals during which nothing can be completed and everything worsens by waiting. Servants whispered. Doors opened and shut softly. Lady Frances insisted on taking Margaret from the room, but Poirot refused until the police had seen her exactly as she was. Bell prowled like a bored wolf. Reggie looked steadily sicker. Sir Henry alternated between bluster and fearful silence. Miss Morland sat very still, her hands clasped in her lap, and watched everyone. Poirot watched the portrait. When at last the local inspector arrived, a competent reddish man named Graves, not yet old enough to have learned conceit, he listened with some astonishment to the outline of what had occurred, viewed the body, and at once formed the obvious opinion. The dead man had clutched a piece of Margaret's gown. She had been found alone beside him. She admitted quarrelling with him in private moments before the blow. The accusation on the portrait gave motive of some obscure emotional sort. From a police standpoint, it was all regrettably neat. Graves was respectful to Poirot without being servile, which I liked in him, but he was also practical. "I'm bound to say, sir," he murmured aside to Poirot, "it looks black against Miss Ashcombe." "Yes," said Poirot, "which is why I distrust it." The inspector glanced toward the portrait. "And that painting business?" "Important, but not in the way you think." Graves had Margaret's maid fetch a wrapper and then, with as much tact as circumstances allowed, told her she must consider herself not formally charged, but not free. She drew herself up. "That means you think I killed him." "It means, miss, that I cannot ignore appearances." "No," said Margaret bitterly. "No one in this house ignores appearances. That is the trouble." The body was removed a little after midnight. I confess I was exhausted and more than a little disordered in mind when at last Poirot and I withdrew. Yet I noticed that he still carried with the greatest care the scrap of note found near Margaret's door. Once we were alone, I said, "You don't believe she did it." Poirot was removing his patent shoes. "I believe she is vain, impulsive, romantic, and perhaps not very truthful. But I do not believe she stabbed Vidal from behind with a palette knife while he stood unveiling a secret to her. It is not her crime." "Then whose?" He placed the shoes side by side with exactitude. "The person who wrote murderous across the portrait wished to accuse Margaret. The person who sent the note wished to bring her alone to the studio. The person who killed Vidal extinguished the lamp and escaped in darkness. Everything points to Margaret. Therefore the true object was not merely to kill Vidal, but to have Margaret take the burden of it." "That seems plain enough, but why?" Poirot looked at me over the tips of his moustaches. "Because Vidal was about to reveal something hidden in the portrait. Something old, something dangerous. We must ask ourselves not who hated the painter, but who feared the painting." He set the scrap of velvet beside the button on the mantelpiece. "Tomorrow, Hastings, we go backward. Always, when murder appears sudden, the roots are old." "What about the American woman?" Poirot's face sharpened. "Yes, the dead woman in Paris. That thread returns, I think." He had just said it when there came another knock at the door. So soft this time that for an instant I thought I had imagined it. Poirot opened it. Outside stood Adrian Bell, pale under his usual irony. "I dislike melodrama," he said, "but I dislike being murdered even more. If you want the truth, Monsieur Poirot, you had better hear me now. Because I believe Vidal told me 3 nights ago the name of the person who first posed for that portrait." Poirot stepped aside. "Enter then, monsieur, for I think you are at last about to be useful." Some of you have asked if there's another way to support us right now. There is one we'd like to share, and it's something my wife and I created together. Alongside Nocturnal Tales, we wrote a children's book called Sherlock Paws and the Diamond of the Nile, available on Amazon. It's a classic detective story, reimagined for younger readers, with one important twist. Sherlock Holmes is a dog. In this story, Sherlock Paws and his loyal companion Dr. Spot set off on an adventure to Egypt, where a valuable diamond has vanished. With noses twitching and tails wagging, they rely on observation, logic, and attention to detail to uncover the truth. It's a mystery full of friendship, travel, and discovery. Adventurous, but always warm and age-appropriate. The goal of the book is simple: to introduce children to detective thinking in a way that feels playful and engaging. Instead of noise and spectacle, the story rewards curiosity. Children are encouraged to notice clues, think things through, and enjoy how small details matter, just as they do in classic mysteries. If you have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, or young readers in your family, this is a story we genuinely believe they might enjoy. And if you're looking for a way to support our work during this difficult period, purchasing the book helps us directly, while giving something tangible, thoughtful, and fun in return. As always, there's no obligation. We simply wanted to share something we made together with the same care we put into everything else. The link is in the description, and thank you truly for being here. Chapter 5. The First Sitter. It is a grave mistake to suppose that because a man is cynical, he is therefore brave. On the contrary, I have often found that those who make a profession of detachment are the very first to become alarmed when events cease to be amusing and begin to threaten themselves personally. Adrian Bell had worn throughout the evening the expression of one who regarded the rest of mankind as a moderately diverting exhibition staged for his private benefit. But when he entered our room that night, closed the door carefully behind him, and glanced once over his shoulder into the passage, I saw that whatever irony remained to him was now being exercised under strain. Poirot pointed to a chair. "Sit down, monsieur." Bell remained standing for a moment. "I should prefer a cigarette." "You would prefer many things. Sit first." Bell obeyed with bad grace. He was still in evening clothes, but his tie had loosened, and his hair was no longer so perfectly arranged. In the bright light of our room he looked older than I had thought earlier, drawn about the eyes and with that faint sallowness which in a man often betrays long habits of indoor life, late hours, and stimulants disguised as sophistication. "Begin," said Poirot. Bell moistened his lips. "You said downstairs that the portrait had been painted over. That is true. I did not know the exact nature of the hidden image, but I knew Vidal had used the same canvas before." "How?" "Because he told me." "Tonight?" "No. 3 nights ago, in London, at the Arts Club. He had dined too well and was in one of his confessional moods, which, with Vidal, usually meant he wanted to boast without appearing to do so." Poirot said nothing. Bell continued. "He told me that the portrait of Miss Ashcombe was not, in the strictest sense, original. He said he had begun another portrait on the same canvas months earlier, abandoned it, and later reused it. I asked why he had done such a thing, because a man in his position can scarcely be too poor for canvas. He laughed and said that economy had nothing to do with it. "Sometimes," he said, "one paints over an error because one wishes not to look at it again." "And did he say who the first sitter was?" Bell hesitated. "Yes." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "The name?" Bell looked from Poirot to me and back again. "Mrs. Eleanor Vane." The name meant nothing to me, and I dare say my expression showed it. Poirot, however, gave only the slightest lift of the brows. "Not the American?" "No." "That is curious," said Poirot, "because the others already connect this matter with a dead woman in Paris." Bell shrugged, though uneasily. "Then perhaps there are 2 dead women in Vidal's past instead of 1. It would be very like him." "Who was Mrs. Eleanor Vane?" "A widow, English, clever, ambitious, very much in society for a year or 2 and then gone from it. She had money of her own, some connection by marriage to people of consequence, and a face Vidal found worth painting because it could look innocent and dangerous simultaneously. She sat for him last spring. And now? She is dead." I leaned forward. "Dead how?" Bell glanced at me. "An overdose of chloral, I believe. At her house in Chelsea. Officially an accident, though there was gossip enough to feed the whole of Mayfair for a fortnight." Poirot's fingers met delicately. "And Vidal knew her well?" Bell let out a short laugh. "Vidal knew all women well, at least for a season, Mrs. Vane included." "Did he love her?" "My dear Poirot, Vidal loved only 2 things reliably, his own talent and other people's admiration. But he may have needed her." Poirot let that pass. "And why do you come with this information tonight instead of earlier?" Bell's face tightened. "Because earlier it was merely unpleasant. Now a man is dead. And you fear that if you remain silent, suspicion may fall where it should not." Bell's mouth twisted. "I fear that if I remain silent, suspicion may eventually fall where it should." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, Honesty at last. It becomes you better than wit, monsieur. Bell ignored that. There is more. Vidal did not simply mention Mrs. Vane's name. He said something else. Something, I thought at the time, theatrical nonsense. He told me that the first portrait had gone wrong because the face revealed what the throat remembered. Those were his words. I confess that sent a distinct chill through me. Poirot's expression remained calm, but his eyes had brightened. "The throat remembered," he repeated. "Interesting." Bell stood abruptly and crossed to the mantelpiece, where the small objects Poirot had collected lay in a neat row, the white button, the scrap of green velvet, and the folded note from Margaret's door. "You see why I am not enjoying this," he said. Vidal hints at hidden truths in paint. A woman dies. Another portrait is begun over the first. Someone scrawls murderous across it, and then Vidal is stabbed before he can explain himself. It is all absurdly literary. "Life," said Poirot, "is often literary. It is only literature that must struggle to become lifelike." Bell turned. "I told you one other thing downstairs. I said Vidal named the first sitter. That was true. But I omitted that he also said another person in this house would recognize the underpainting if ever it were seen in a slant light." "Did he say who?" Bell's hesitation was answer enough. "He did not speak the name plainly. He only said, 'She will know at once. She saw the hands before.'" Miss Morland's mention of the Paris death, the hidden image at the throat, the word murderous, and now this singular phrase together formed a pattern so ugly that even I, who am no detective, felt its shape without understanding it. Poirot was silent a moment. "You believed," he said at last, "that the she meant Miss Ashcombe. I assumed so. But now—" Bell spread his hands. "Now I assume nothing. That house is full of women who know more than they say." Poirot rose. "Hastings, ring for hot water. Monsieur Bell will remain here tonight." Bell stared. "Remain? In your room?" "Yes." "That is ridiculous." "That is prudent. You came to me because you are frightened. Do not insult me by pretending otherwise." Bell flushed angrily, then gave a little shrug. "Very well. But if I am to be treated like a schoolboy, at least allow me another cigarette." Poirot ignored the request and went instead to the door. "You will sleep on the sofa. I prefer to keep the people who know things where they may be conveniently found in the morning." Bell actually laughed then, though without much pleasure. "You are a domestic tyrant, Poirot." "Yes, it is one of my smallest virtues." The events of the following morning did nothing to reduce the tension at Blackthorn House. One might have imagined, in the abstract, that a death in the household would produce solemnity and quiet. In reality, it produced whispers, suppressed movements, sudden silences when one entered a room, and that most exhausting of all social atmospheres, universal restraint laid over universal curiosity. Breakfast was nominally served at the usual hour, though very little was eaten. Sir Henry did not appear, claiming distress of the heart. Reggie came late, hollow-eyed and untidy. Lady Frances was composed but coolly observant. Dr. Kerr looked as though he had not slept. Margaret did not come down at all. Miss Morland, pale but steady, presided in default of the others. Inspector Graves had already begun his inquiries in earnest, and I learned before noon that he had found the matter increasingly damning for Margaret. The note drawing her to the studio, far from helping her, merely proved she had gone secretly there. Her gown supplied the velvet found in Vidal's hand. Worse still, the missing button Poirot had discovered was judged by Graves to have been torn away during a struggle, though Poirot objected that no struggle of consequence had taken place. Margaret's maid, too, had admitted that her mistress had been deeply agitated after dinner, and had more than once spoken wildly of ending all this. It was easy enough to see how a local jury might make of that what it pleased. Poirot, however, seemed in no way impressed by the obvious case. He spent the morning first with Inspector Graves in the studio, then with Vidal's belongings, then in the servants' quarters, where he asked 100 petty questions which I could not then imagine to matter. Which bell had rung when, who had carried hot water, who had seen a lamp lit or extinguished, who knew the arrangements of the studio wing, which servants had unpacked Vidal's crates, and whether any messages had arrived from London in the preceding 2 days. By luncheon he had established, among other things, that Vidal had received a telegram on the day of our arrival, had read it alone, and had burned it in the grate of his bedroom. Only a corner remained, too charred to help us. He had also learned that the painter's valet had been dismissed a fortnight earlier and not replaced, that Vidal had been irritable all through the previous afternoon, and that he had taken unusual care to keep the finished portrait covered even from accidental view. Jealous of his effect, I suggested. Poirot shook his head. Afraid of his effect. Bell, who had been kept under something like informal supervision, joined us in the library after luncheon. He had recovered some of his habitual dryness, though now and then I saw his eyes go quickly to the door. "Have you decided which of us is the villain?" he asked. Poirot looked up from the writing table where he had been sorting notes. "Yes." Bell stiffened. Poirot added calmly, "But I have decided it provisionally 7 times since breakfast, so you need not feel distinguished." Bell sat down with an exhalation. "You are intolerable." "I am methodical." At that moment Miss Morland entered. "Monsieur Poirot, Margaret asks whether she may speak with you." Poirot rose at once. "In her room?" "Yes. She has not left it?" He followed Miss Morland upstairs. I would have accompanied him, but he shook his head, and I remained below with Bell, who wandered to the window and stood looking out across the wet lawns. After a minute he said, almost absently, "If he had any sense, Vidal would have burned that painting months ago." "You disliked him?" Bell turned. "I disliked his tricks." "You feared him too." Bell gave me a level glance. "Captain Hastings, men like Vidal are only feared when they have acquired knowledge they do not understand well enough to use wisely." That struck me as a singular statement, but before I could press him, Poirot returned. He looked thoughtful rather than triumphant, which with him usually meant progress mixed with complication. "What happened?" I asked. Poirot sat down. "Miss Ashcombe told me 2 things of interest. First, that Vidal had indeed shown signs of fear before his death, not fear of her, but of someone else in the house. Second, that 6 months ago she saw in Vidal's London studio a charcoal study of another woman's neck and shoulders, unfinished, but with dark marks at the throat exactly where we now see them beneath her portrait." Bell started. "And she said nothing?" "She thought it some morbid artistic fancy. She says now that the woman resembled, slightly, someone she had met later at a dinner in Chelsea." "Mrs. Vane?" I asked. "Precisely." Bell's mouth hardened. "Then Mrs. Vane was the first sitter after all?" Poirot inclined his head. "So it appears. Why does that matter more than the Paris woman?" Poirot folded his hands. "Because the dead in Paris may supply atmosphere, scandal, romance, all the things people like to discuss, but the dead in Chelsea may supply motive." It was on that word that Reggie Ashcombe burst into the library without knocking. He looked thoroughly shaken. "Poirot, Inspector Graves wants everyone in the morning room. There's been another row. Uncle's nearly apoplectic. Lady Frances says she won't stay in the house another night. And—" He stopped. "And what?" said Poirot. Reggie swallowed. "They've found something in Vidal's room." The something proved to be a photograph. We found the little assembly already gathered in the morning room, Sir Henry purple and furious in an armchair, Lady Frances standing beside the mantel with compressed lips, Dr. Kerr very grave, Miss Morland by the writing desk, and Inspector Graves holding a square of stiff card by one corner, as though it were liable to explode. Margaret was not present. Graves looked up as we entered. This came from a drawer in the deceased gentleman's room, hidden under a false bottom in his dressing case. He handed the object to Poirot. It was a small photograph, somewhat faded. It showed a woman seated in profile beside a studio screen. The image was not exceptionally clear, but there was enough to see that she was dark-haired, elegant, and striking. Around her throat, unmistakably, was the shadow of a band or mark. On the back, in Vidal's hand, were written the words E.V., First State. She knew. Bell let out a slow breath. Eleanor Vane. Sir Henry broke in with angry impatience. What the devil does it mean? Who is she? And why is all this rubbish turning up in my house? Poirot did not answer immediately. He was studying not the woman's face, but the writing on the back. Graves said, "There's more. In the same compartment was a newspaper cutting, report of Mrs. Vane's death, chloral poisoning, coroner's verdict, accidental overdose." Dr. Kerr held out his hand. "May I see it?" Graves passed him the cutting. The doctor scanned it, and I noticed a curious expression cross his face, something between recognition and discomfort. Poirot noticed it too. "You know the name, Doctor?" Kerr looked up. "I knew of her. Professionally, in a way." "In what way?" There was the faintest pause. "I was called to see Mrs. Vane once last year. Nothing serious. Insomnia, nerves. She had a tendency to self-dramatization." Lady Frances said quietly, "Half the women in Chelsea had that." Poirot turned to her. "And did you know Mrs. Vane also, madame?" Lady Frances met his gaze with admirable steadiness. "Yes, slightly." "Was she a friend of Mr. Vidal?" "She was one of his admirers," said Bell, before she could reply. That was usually enough. Poirot laid the photograph on the table. "And Miss Ashcombe met her at dinner, she says." Sir Henry stared. Margaret knew this woman. "Only by sight, perhaps," said Poirot. The old man struck the arm of his chair. "Then why the devil has none of this been spoken of before?" Nobody answered that. The reason was plain enough. In houses like Blackthorn, uncomfortable facts do not fail to exist. They fail to be mentioned. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "There's another point, sir. The hidden drawer also contained a bank receipt. £500 paid in cash to the deceased 3 weeks ago through a London branch. We are trying to trace by whom." Bell said flatly, "Blackmail, then." "Perhaps," said Poirot. "Or perhaps payment for silence." Sir Henry snapped, "Silence about what?" Poirot's eyes lifted to the portrait photograph. About what the throat remembered. It was an extraordinarily theatrical answer for Poirot, and had it been uttered by anybody else I should have disliked it. But he was not being theatrical. He was thinking aloud. Graves, a sensible fellow, ignored the phrase and came to the practical point. "I must ask, Sir Henry, whether anyone in your family had acquaintance with this Mrs. Vane beyond Miss Ashcombe's seeing her at a dinner." Sir Henry glowered. "None that I know of." "Miss Morland?" "No." "Mr. Ashcombe?" Reggie started. "I never met her." "Lady Frances?" "We moved in some of the same circles. Nothing more." "Doctor?" "As I said, professionally." Graves made notes. Poirot, however, had turned toward the window, where the afternoon light lay grey and flat upon the lawn. He seemed to have withdrawn inward, arranging again his invisible pieces. Then, quite suddenly, he said, "Inspector, before you continue, I would like to ask one question of the whole company." Graves nodded. Poirot faced us all. Which of you, before the portrait was defaced, had already seen enough of it to recognize what lay beneath? A most curious silence followed. Not one person answered. Not one person even feigned surprise. It was that, more than anything said, which told me the question had struck home. Sir Henry looked furious but wary. Lady Frances's eyelids lowered almost imperceptibly. Dr. Kerr gazed at the hearthrug. Bell stared at Poirot with open irritation. Miss Morland alone seemed genuinely bewildered. Reggie looked merely lost. Poirot let the silence lengthen. "Ah," he said at last. "Then the circle grows smaller." But he did not say how small, nor whom he had begun to exclude. Instead, he thanked Inspector Graves, requested permission to examine once more the back stairs and the lamp in the studio corridor, and with me at his heels withdrew from the room. Once outside, I caught his arm. "You know something?" "Yes." "What?" He gave me an exasperated look. "Hastings, when I know, I know. When I suspect, I remain silent." "Then you suspect something." "Several somethings, one of them very strongly." We had reached the gallery overlooking the hall. From below came the muffled stir of servants and the distant murmur of Graves continuing his work. I lowered my voice. "This will be the end for Margaret unless you act quickly." Poirot turned to me with unusual seriousness. "No. This will be the end for Margaret only if the murderer succeeds in forcing the wrong story upon the facts. That is what has happened from the beginning. First the note, then the painted accusation, then the secret summons to the studio, then the velvet in Vidal's hand. It is not murder alone. It is composition." "Then why not say so openly?" "Because," said Poirot, "when one tears a bad painting too soon from its frame, one destroys the evidence of the artist's intention." That was all very well, but it did not help me much. We had just reached the head of the back stair when there came the sound of hurried feet below, followed by a servant's startled voice. A moment later, Inspector Graves himself appeared at the turn of the staircase, holding in his hand an envelope. "It was just brought by bicycle from the village post office," he said. "Addressed to Monsieur Poirot. No sender." Poirot took it and opened it at once. Inside was a single card bearing 6 words, cut from printed type and pasted crookedly in place. "Ask Sir Henry about Chelsea." Poirot read it, and for the first time since we had come to Blackthorn, I saw on his face not surprise exactly, but the look of a man whose strongest suspicion has just shifted into something nearer certainty. "What is it?" I asked. He slipped the card into his pocket. "It is," he said softly, "the first honest lie we have received." Chapter 6. What the Throat Remembered. I have never known Poirot more difficult than on the morning after he receives what he calls the useful little push. He becomes at once more active and more secretive. He asks simple questions with maddening precision, arranges chairs, inspects windows, speaks kindly to the wrong people, and gives the appearance of idleness only to those too dull to notice that the whole household has begun imperceptibly to move to his design. The anonymous card advising him to ask Sir Henry about Chelsea produced exactly that effect. He did not, however, march at once to Sir Henry and demand explanations, as I should certainly have done. Instead, he spent the remainder of the afternoon gathering what seemed to me the pettiest confirmations. He had Inspector Graves send inquiries to London regarding Mrs. Eleanor Vane's death, the bank receipt found among Vidal's effects, and the Chelsea dinner at which Margaret had said she met Mrs. Vane. He had the butler produce the visitor's book for the past year. He examined once more the key to the studio, the extinguished lamp, the back passage, and the arrangement of the furniture on the night of the murder. He asked Miss Morland whether Margaret habitually wore that particular green gown buttoned close at the cuff. He asked Reggie whether his sister was left or right-handed. He asked Dr. Kerr whether chloral taken excessively necessarily implied suicide. He even asked Ellis the footman whether Sir Henry ever descended the back stairs after dinner or preferred the main staircase out of dignity. By 6 o'clock the same evening, he announced that everyone was to assemble in the drawing-room at 7:30. Inspector Graves, who had by then developed a healthy respect for Poirot's methods, agreed readily enough. "You have something, then?" "Yes," said Poirot. "I have a little order. That is usually enough." The company gathered with varying degrees of composure and resentment. Sir Henry came first, grumbling and florid, supported more by indignation than by health. Lady Frances entered cool and unreadable. Reggie looked miserable. Miss Morland was pale but steady. Dr. Kerr had the face of a man who knows the next half hour will be disagreeable and intends to meet it standing. Bell lounged in last and lit a cigarette until Graves curtly informed him he would put it out. Margaret was brought down under informal supervision, her colour restored, but her expression hard. She looked, I thought, less frightened now than furious. Furious at suspicion, at helplessness, at the whole ugly machinery of scandal. Poirot waited until all had settled. Then he stood before the fireplace and began in the quiet voice I knew so well. "We are here because Monsieur Vidal was murdered in the studio, and because the evidence was arranged to make Miss Ashcombe appear his murderer. That much, I think, is no longer difficult to see. The note brought her to the studio. The painted accusation prepared opinion against her. The scrap of green velvet in Vidal's hand and the missing button on her sleeve pointed toward struggle. Yet the blow was struck from behind, expertly and at a moment when Vidal was not watching her at all." Inspector Graves inclined his head. "That's my view now as well." "Good. Then we proceed. The first question is not who killed Vidal. It is, what did Vidal know that made it necessary to kill him, and why was Miss Ashcombe chosen to bear the blame?" He turned toward the portrait, which now stood once more in the drawing-room, shrouded but not removed. "The answer lies here. The portrait of Miss Ashcombe was painted over an earlier portrait of another woman, Mrs. Eleanor Vane of Chelsea. Under a slant light one sees at the throat the dark trace of fingers, as though someone had once painted there the memory of strangulation." Margaret gave a shiver. Sir Henry looked impatient and alarmed at once. "Are we to have a lecture on paint?" "No," said Poirot, "on conscience." He looked toward Dr. Kerr. "Doctor, you told us you knew Mrs. Vane professionally." "That was true, but not the whole truth. She was not merely your patient. She was also connected to this house through Sir Henry." There was a dead silence. Sir Henry half rose. "What infernal nonsense!" Poirot raised a hand. Mrs. Eleanor Vane was, I have learned this afternoon, Sir Henry's goddaughter. She had known him since childhood. After her husband died, Sir Henry assisted her in certain financial difficulties. She came often to Blackthorn. That is why your visitor's book shows her name here last spring. Sir Henry sank back, breathing hard. "That proves nothing." "On the contrary, it proves the first concealment. Everybody in this room who knew Mrs. Vane has tried to make her a stranger." "Why?" "Because once one admits her connection to Blackthorn, one must ask why her portrait was painted by Vidal, why she later died in Chelsea under questionable circumstances, and why Vidal kept both her photograph and the cutting about her death hidden among his things." Lady Frances spoke at last. "Questionable? Her death was ruled accidental." Poirot turned. "Yes, with chloral. But the cutting found with it shows something else. That before Mrs. Vane died, she told her maid she was being driven mad by a man who wanted silence." Bell gave a soft curse. Graves said sharply, "That line wasn't in the public reports." "No. It was in the Fuller police summary telephoned through by London this afternoon. Poirot's eyes moved back to Lady Frances. You knew that, did you not? Her expression did not alter, but her hands tightened slightly. I knew she was unhappy. You knew more than that. You were with her the week before she died. Lady Frances said nothing. Poirot continued. Mrs. Vane had discovered something at Blackthorn, something concerning money and signatures. She had reason to believe Sir Henry had used family trust papers irregularly, and that large sums were being concealed through private arrangements. She threatened exposure. That alone would have caused scandal, perhaps ruin. But there was more. She had also quarrelled violently with Sir Henry one evening in the studio wing. Sir Henry burst out, This is monstrous. She was hysterical, a troublesome woman. Perhaps, said Poirot. But troublesome women do not paint finger marks on their own throats in portraits. Someone else saw those marks. Monsieur Vidal. He drew back the covering from the portrait. A murmur went around the room. Poirot had arranged the lamps so that their light crossed the canvas obliquely. There again, clear now once one knew where to look, lay the shadowy under-image at the throat, a dark pressure beneath the painted skin. When Vidal first painted Mrs. Vane, Poirot said, he observed bruising at her neck. Whether he knew then how she got them, I do not say. But he noticed them, and in a first state of the portrait he included them. Later, perhaps after pressure from the sitter, or after he understood the danger, he altered the work. Months passed. Mrs. Vane died of chloral in Chelsea, officially accidental, yet Vidal kept the first canvas. Why? Because he had begun to suspect what those marks meant. Miss Morland spoke under her breath. She had been attacked. Yes, not killed then, but attacked. He turned slowly toward Sir Henry. And by whom? By the one person in this house with the strongest reason to silence Mrs. Vane, Sir Henry Morland. Margaret made a sharp sound of disbelief. Reggie stared at his uncle. Sir Henry had gone a greyish red. I never laid a hand on her. Poirot nodded. Not to kill her, only to frighten her. Perhaps you seized her in rage by the throat. Perhaps you attempted to take papers from her. Perhaps you did not understand your own strength. But Vidal saw the bruises and remembered them. Mrs. Vane later died before she could make her accusations public. And you, Sir Henry, relied on the coroner's verdict and money to bury the matter. Sir Henry rose, trembling. This is slander. Is it? Then perhaps you explain the bank receipt, £500 paid to Vidal 3 weeks ago. Payment for what? Not for a portrait, not from a patron. It was sent through one of your London agents. Graves cut in at once. We traced it. The cashier identified the intermediary. He works for Morland and Bryce. That landed like a hammer. Sir Henry stared at Graves, then at Poirot. It was only to keep the fellow from talking rubbish. Exactly, said Poirot, to keep him silent. But Vidal, being Vidal, found silence profitable only for so long. When he began painting Miss Ashcombe on the old canvas, he discovered that the under-image still showed in certain light. He understood at once that if Margaret saw it, she might ask questions. So might others. He became frightened and greedy simultaneously. He hinted to Bell. He quarrelled with Sir Henry. He may even have threatened to expose the earlier affair unless paid more. Bell said dryly, That sounds like him. Poirot bowed his head very slightly. It does. Then someone else enters the story. He turned now not to Sir Henry but to Lady Frances Welby. And that someone, madame, is you. If he had announced that the moon had fallen into the lawn, the room could scarcely have shown greater astonishment. Lady Frances did not cry out. She stood quite still. Indeed, she said. Yes. You wrote the first note. You wrote murderous across the portrait. You sent a second note to Miss Ashcombe, and you killed Monsieur Vidal." Margaret sprang up. "Lady Frances?" Reggie blurted. "That's impossible." Graves had gone very still. Poirot spoke on. "You knew of the old affair because you were Mrs. Vane's friend. More than that, you knew Sir Henry's financial dependence on secrecy, and you had reason to protect him." At that, Miss Morland stared. "Protect him?" Poirot inclined his head. "Because Sir Henry had for years subsidized Lady Frances quietly. Her own circumstances, though elegant, are not what they appear. If Mrs. Vane exposed Sir Henry's irregular dealings, the stream dried up. It was in Lady Frances's interest that Mrs. Vane be discredited, and later that any revival of the matter be prevented." Lady Frances's voice was still level but lower now. "You can prove none of this." "I can prove enough. On the night Mrs. Vane was attacked at Blackthorn, you were here. On the day before her death in Chelsea, you visited her. The maid remembered your perfume, verbena. The same faint scent was still on the fragment of rag found in Vidal's turpentine jar. You used it to wipe the brush after painting the word across the portrait." Lady Frances's colour changed, just perceptibly. Poirot continued relentlessly. "You also had access to Miss Ashcombe's green gown earlier that evening. While the ladies dressed for dinner, you borrowed from her maid a small workbox to mend what you called a loose cuff hook. In fact, you removed one button from the sleeve and kept it. Later, after Vidal was stabbed, the painter instinctively clutched at the person nearest him, or rather at what was thrust into his hand. The piece of green velvet found there was torn earlier by you from the hem facing of Margaret's gown when you brushed past it in her room. It was planted evidence." Margaret stared in horror. "My room? Then you—" "Yes," said Poirot. "Lady Frances had the freedom of the house and of your confidence." Graves stepped forward. "The button too?" Poirot nodded. "The button found under the portrait was not torn in struggle. It was dropped deliberately beforehand. The true killer is taller than Miss Ashcombe and right-handed. The blow entered downward at an angle more consistent with Lady Frances than with Margaret. And there is one more point, the extinguished corridor lamp. Lady Frances alone among the women here is used to the back passage and the old dimmer lever beside the studio door. She turned it down before striking." Dr. Kerr said suddenly in a strained voice, "But why kill Vidal then? Why not simply get the portrait destroyed?" Poirot looked at him. "Because Vidal had ceased to be manageable. He summoned Miss Ashcombe secretly, intending perhaps to alarm her into immediate marriage and flight, perhaps to begin bargaining anew. Lady Frances intercepted the plan. She sent the false note first to Margaret, then went ahead to the studio. When Vidal drew back the cloth and began to speak, she struck from behind with the palette knife. In the confusion and darkness, she pushed past Margaret, leaving paint on her gown and planting the appearance of guilt. Graves said, "And the anonymous card to you today? Ask Sir Henry about Chelsea?" Poirot's eyes rested on Lady Frances. That was the last clever act. Lady Frances saw that suspicion might settle too heavily on Margaret too quickly and break the construction before it had served its purpose. So she sent me toward Sir Henry, truthfully, because Sir Henry was indeed at the root of the earlier scandal, but dishonestly, because she hoped I would stop there and mistake moral guilt for murder. Bell gave a short laugh of astonishment. "The first honest lie." "Precisely." All eyes were on Lady Frances now. She had not moved. Only her face, which had seemed so carefully composed, had become older in the past minute, as though the skin itself had slackened. At last she said, "You make me into a melodrama villainess. It is vulgar." Poirot's reply was cold. "No. I make you what you are, A woman who chose convenience over truth once, then fear over pity, then murder over exposure. Something in that struck through her control. She turned sharply on Sir Henry. "You weak old fool," she said. "If you had paid Vidal and burned the canvas, none of this would have happened." Sir Henry gave a choking sound. "Frances—" "Yes, Frances. Who else has been tidying after you for years? Eleanor threatened you and you panicked. You put your hands on her like a common brute. Afterward you wept and bribed and lied and sent me to smooth everything over." Miss Morland made a horrified movement. Reggie stared as though he had never seen Lady Frances before. Poirot said quietly, "And in Chelsea?" Lady Frances closed her eyes briefly. "In Chelsea," she said, "Eleanor had become impossible. She had taken chloral for sleep often enough. It was easy to persuade her doctor that she confused doses. I did not force it down her throat, if that is what you want. I only made certain she had enough and no one to stop her." Dr. Kerr gave a low, shocked exclamation. Poirot's voice hardened. "That is murder by cowardice. And when Vidal threatened the whole edifice, another murder." Lady Frances opened her eyes. He would have ruined Margaret too, eventually. He was not noble. "No," said Poirot, "but he did not stab himself." For a second I thought she might still deny it, or attempt some last elegance. Instead, she looked toward the portrait and said almost wearily, "I hated that thing. He had painted her with the same hungry cruelty. All of you men call it truth when it flatters your appetite for exposure." Then, with the speed of a striking snake, she moved one hand to her bodice. Graves was faster. He caught her wrist before she could bring out the small silver vial concealed there. The inspector wrenched it away. "None of that." Lady Frances laughed once, a thin, broken sound. "How tiresome," she said. Graves nodded to the constable at the door. That was the end of it. There remained, of course, the wreckage after truth. Sir Henry collapsed into a grotesque mixture of rage and self-pity. Reggie was sick. Miss Morland took Margaret upstairs. Bell stood by the fire with the face of a man who has just watched society remove its gloves and reveal claws. Dr. Kerr sat down suddenly, as though age had come upon him in a rush. As for Poirot, he did not look triumphant. He seldom did in such cases. When at last we were alone, preparing to leave Blackthorn the next morning, I said, "So Sir Henry attacked Mrs. Vane, Lady Frances helped cover it, then later eased her into death, and finally killed Vidal to prevent the whole thing from resurfacing." Poirot nodded. "Yes? There are crimes of passion, Hastings, and crimes of profit. But the ugliest are crimes of maintenance, those committed only to keep up appearances." And Margaret? She was vain, romantic, easily dazzled, but not guilty. She chose a bad man to admire and nearly paid with her liberty. I thought of the painted word across her portrait, and of the hidden marks beneath. What will happen to Sir Henry? Poirot shrugged slightly. The law may not reach him for the attack on Mrs. Vane, perhaps not even for the later death if proof is insufficient, but scandal will do what law cannot. At his age, in his world, that is punishment enough to poison every remaining comfort. He adjusted the fall of his tie. "And now, my friend, we return to London. I have had enough of country houses. They are always full of ancestors on the walls and improprieties in the cupboards." I laughed despite everything. As our car drew away from Blackthorn House, I looked back once. The long red brick facade stood pale in the morning light, respectable, still and handsome. One would never have guessed, to see it, how much had been hidden there beneath polish and velvet and cultivated manners, until paint, memory, and murder had forced it all to the surface. Poirot, following my glance, said only, "One must beware, Hastings, of portraits. They do not always show what a face is. Sometimes they show what a conscience tries to cover."
Thank you for staying with us until the end of the story. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, do subscribe and share it with someone who appreciates a proper mystery. It helps more than most people think, and it remains one of the simplest ways to help this show continue. If you'd like more stories, you can find our full back catalogue on Patreon and Spotify, with extra new stories there as well. And if you'd like to support our work more directly, you can do so on Patreon. Tiers start at $2.99 with ad-free listening and extra stories, or for occasional support via Buy Me a Coffee or PayPal. All links are in the description. Thank you for listening. And now, be fair before you are certain, and do not let confidence outrun the facts. Good night.